Okay, well, welcome again, everyone. Welcome formally. And welcome Natalie once again from Citizens for Public Justice, who is going to lead us in conversation with Stephen Hurley. And I'll introduce them in a moment in our initial input, conversational style. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. But we're really grateful to have Natalie with us once again on kind of like a second part on the Poverty Trends Report 2024 that the Citizens for Public Justice put together. And Natalie will say more about that in a moment. And this evening's focus is on the question of labor. But before we begin, let's just take a moment and we will acknowledge the lands upon which we meet one another, where we come from, mindful of the history that we are part of, the geographical history, the cultural history that we are part of in what the country we call Canada. And speaking on behalf of the Jesuit Forum, although we come from all parts of the country, but the Jesuit Forum, we acknowledge that this land upon which we have the privilege to call home and work from, and what's commonly known as Toronto, is the traditional territory of many Native nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And we do acknowledge that Tuka Toronto, it's also known as by Indigenous peoples, is covered by the Treaty 13 of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And so we are grateful to have the opportunity to call this land of Southern Ontario our common home with Indigenous peoples through a messy history. And so we'll just take a moment and to acknowledge the land upon which you join us from, the traditional land. And you can feel free to enter it into the chat. Let's take a moment. And also to silently acknowledge. So again, thank you everyone for coming. It's good to have you with us once again. And we are grateful that this is not only the Jesuit Forum that we're speaking now, but this series of gatherings upon political discernment with Natalie and Stephen. Many partners have been involved in putting this short series together, amongst Citizens for Public Justice, of course, Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Toronto, the Sisters of St. Joseph and their Ministry for Social Justice, Peace and Creation Care Office, the Mary Ward Center, which is part of the Loretto Sisters here in Toronto, Canada, Catholic Conscience, Centre Oblat, and ORCE, the Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology. And I hope I'm not missing anyone. So all of our organizations together have been working behind the scenes to put these evenings together. Today's gathering will be in two parts. We're going to have an initial discussion between Natalie Appleyard, who's the socioeconomic policy analyst at Citizens for Public Justice and one of the co-authors of their Poverty Trends Report 2024. I think it's actually formerly Poverty Trends 2024 report, together with Stephen Hurley, who's the chief catalyst for Voice Ed Radio, which is dedicated to sharing insights and ideas about education in Canada. And Stephen Hurley is also with the Toronto School of Theology, which is the part of University of Toronto. And so this part of our gathering will be recorded and it'll be edited into a podcast format as well in the coming short weeks. And then our second part of the evening will be breaking up into small groups to reflect on, in small circles, on some reflection questions, which will be facilitated and which will not be recorded. So at this juncture, I will hand our evening over, this part of our evening, to Natalie and Stephen. Welcome.
Thank you, Trevor. And Natalie, it's great to be with you again. Welcome back.
Thank you. Likewise. I'm excited.
Yeah. And as Father Trevor said, we are talking tonight about the question of labor. Last time we met previously on political discernment, you were speaking about the question of affordability. And I know the two topics are related, intimately related, in fact. I wondered if we could begin by having you unpack a little bit more about what we mean by poverty. Sometimes we're tempted to group everyone that is considered to be poor as we put the in front of it, the poor. But tell us a little bit more about what that means and what criteria are used to determine poverty in this country.
Sure. So at CPJ, when we talk about poverty, we're not just talking about people who are falling on hard times and need a bit of assistance to get through a rough patch. We're really talking about some chronic systemic patterns in terms of who is most likely to experience poverty, and people who are not able to access an adequate standard of living because the goods and services that they need are either unaffordable or completely unavailable. So we're not focusing just on sort of tough circumstances, but rather more systemic patterns that we see, these persistent trends across generations, across communities. And so when we are defining poverty, we can define it and measure it in a number of different ways. So one of the most common ways is to look at people's wealth or their income. And so we have a couple measures in Canada that are typically used. We have Canada's official poverty line, which uses the market basket measure, which basically asks, can you afford this basket of goods and services that would be needed to have a moderate standard of living? And they look at what sort of income people have, what sort of government transfers they receive, if they get any rent subsidies. They factor in all those government programs. And the question is, can you afford the basket or not? Yes or no? And that basket is costed out for different parts of the country, for different sizes of communities, different population densities, different household sizes. So that's one measure. It's Canada's official measure. We prefer the low income measure, which looks at relative amounts of income or wealth. So that defines poverty by saying, okay, for a household of this size, this is the median income for these types of households. If you have less than half of that, then you would be considered low income and to be living in poverty. But these income-based measures, neither of them are perfect, and they tend to have lower estimates in terms of people experiencing poverty than if we look at measures of, say, core housing need or food insecurity. So these other measures are really important to paint a clearer picture of what people are actually experiencing, because what we see is that people can actually have income well above the poverty threshold, but still be struggling to afford their housing or afford food or medication or other basic costs of living. So again, we see really persistent trends in terms of who is most likely to be impacted by poverty in Canada and who's most deeply impacted. And so that indicates to us that this isn't just folks falling on hard times, but that there are some systemic issues at play here.
Lots to unpack there, and we hope over the next little bit we'll be able to challenge some of the assumptions that many of us may make about poverty. I know the people that are gathered here today probably are more in tune with the complexity that you just outlined, but a lot of us aren't. One of the things that, and this could be a truism to say that one way out of poverty or the path out of poverty is employment, and that's something I think we need to unpack a little bit. Can you help us do that?
Sure. So it's true that for many people, having a job is how we, afford our basic necessities of life, and that requires certain working conditions, that requires certain level of wages and certain types of employment for that to be true. But there are a lot of barriers actually facing people who are experiencing poverty and who are trying to live off of that earned income. And there are lots of reasons why, for example, uh, it's not a simple solution as just, oh, well, if people want to get out of poverty, they just need to get a job. And, here we're kind of implying a lot of kind of unspoken prejudices that people in poverty are just lazy, and or that they are just mismanaging their funds or making bad decisions, or people don't want to work. And every generation says that. So what we see actually is that when we look at the proportion of food insecure households in the provinces, and I say in the provinces because the data that I'm referring to didn't include data for the territories, but in 2022, Proof, which is a food insecurity research unit out of the University of Toronto, they found that actually over 60% of food insecure households were people who were employed and people for whom their employment was their main source of income. So most people who are experiencing poverty and food insecurity are already working. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that not enough? If we look at it another way, if we look at, so that's kind of looking at what proportion of food insecure households are working. If we look at, the population of people in the provinces whose main source of income is employment, then 17% of all those households are experiencing food insecurity. So there's kind of two different ways of looking at that picture. And we can compare that to people who are also experiencing unemployment, for example. So if you compare 17% of people who are whose main source of income is their employment, who are experiencing food insecurity, we can compare that to 47% of people who are receiving employment insurance. So people who had been working but have lost their employment. If we look at people whose main source of income is social assistance, it jumps to 69.9% of people in provinces that are experiencing food insecurity. So we see that it is true that that employment is one of the pathways out of poverty, or can be, but it's certainly not a sure bet. And again, most people who are experiencing food insecurity are already working. And then what we see is that for folks who can't work and are receiving social assistance, we're seeing just the gross inadequacy of supports for people in that situation. And that's true for whether they're on social assistance or receiving employment insurance. So there's lots of reasons why that may be. But so we've seen, again, if folks are working, why are they still poor? Well, wages haven't kept pace with the cost of living. We're seeing an increase in people working in what we refer to as the gig economy. So think of like your Uber drivers, your food delivery people, people that are in that kind of precarious gig work. Often are doing that kind of work because their main source of employment, the wages are insufficient. And so that's what labor researchers have found, is that this gig economy has really blossomed because of the inadequacy of wages. We also find that people who are working don't have access to basic rights like paid sick leave. They don't have access to health benefits. And so what we're seeing with this sort of perfect storm of low wages, lack of access to paid sick leave, to lack of access to health benefits, is that people who are receiving social assistance actually find themselves in a situation where they can't afford to start working. The wages are so low for many of the jobs that they're entering into, these entry-level jobs, which, you know, certainly is not the case for everyone on social assistance, but for many people, if they're starting out in an entry-level job, the wages are so low, they don't have access to sick leave or health benefits. There are probably additional costs of living that now they have to cover, whether that's clothing or transportation or maybe childcare. So they're having these additional costs. And even with the gross inadequacy of social assistance benefits, their employment makes them even worse off. And so people get trapped in this cycle because the moment they start to work, their social assistance starts getting clawed back and reduced. So we're seeing people getting kind of trapped in this situation where, well, social assistance doesn't give them enough money maybe for their rent and housing, but at least they have health benefits. So for many people, that's where they're forced to stay. And you know, that's not even getting into what jobs are available depending on where you live.
Right. I don't know you well. We've just met about a month and a half ago, but I do know you well enough to know that you have a heart for policy and the policy changes and the policy areas and even the windows of opportunity that might be available. What do we need to do at the policy level to combat some of this, or to make this these transitions better for people that do? I'm particularly intrigued by the people that are working but still are living in precarious situations.
So one way is just mandatory minimum wages, and we see that in various sectors. For example, there's federal minimum wages, there can be provincial minimum wages, and you know that can impact certain industries. But one thing that I'll say as I launch into some of this policy talk is that when we talk about poverty in Canada, we are fundamentally talking about people who can't access their right to an adequate standard of living. And that doesn't mean that the government has to provide everyone with a house or food or even a job, but they do have to create the conditions where people can access that adequate standard of living. And so that requires investments in income supports and programs and infrastructure. It requires government to use regulatory controls. So sometimes that means leaning on industry and employers to make sure that employers aren't cutting corners that are leaving people without, you know, sufficient wages or access to the health benefits that they need. Or people, you know, obviously we have legislation about the maximum hours that people can work. We also have important legislation about, you know, how much notice do you need to provide employees before you change their shifts? Or, you know, how long can someone be working before they get a break? And so in the healthcare sector, Pat Armstrong has coined this marvelous expression, which is the conditions of work are the conditions of care. And so again, for the workers, but also for, you know, the people that are receiving whatever services those workers are providing, those conditions of work are really critical for workers' well-being, which then, you know, has ripple effects to the rest of society. So, so again, minimum wages is one thing, making sure, again, that people have paid sick leave, access to benefits. So those are some kind of regulatory controls that could be placed on employers and industries. But there are other tools that the government has at their disposal, and that can be regulatory controls and investments that can then protect the buying power of the wages that people are earning. So there's, one approach is to increase the wages and make sure that, people have access to employment opportunities and, addressing discrimination in employment rates, just addressing problems with pay equity, for example. These are regulatory controls that can be aimed at the employer, but also, looking at how do we address the cost of living that people are facing. These two go hand in hand, so that one thing that we see, for example, if social assistance gets raised, then often the rent gets raised. And so similarly, we want to make sure, people might be working more. We see situations in the north, for example, where salaries can actually be quite high. And yet the cost of living has skyrocketed so much that, again, you could have someone who's $20,000, even $40,000 over the poverty threshold and still can't afford housing or the food that they need. So again, there's the wage and the income side of it, and then there's also protecting the buying power of those programs. There's some stability that the government could provide there, and some direction in tackling the kinds of discrimination that people are experiencing when seeking work and seeking fair compensation.
We know that the labor market today is not the labor market that was in place 20, 30, 40 years ago. I know when my parents were on a completely different, very dynamic. There's a lot of technological advances. We have advances in green energy, artificial intelligence. It is everywhere. And that has caused some upheaval and discontinuity in many sectors. How do we support those workers that are forced by this technology and advances to make the transitions needed to be able to continue to support them?
So one of the programs that would just provide that security that people need through these times of transition would be a guaranteed basic income, or a guaranteed basic livable income. And that would, again, we've seen evidence from pilot studies from basic income programs in other countries where that level of financial stability has so many wonderful downstream impacts on people's mental health, on their ability to stay housed, to afford the food that they need, which again, has compounding effects in terms of the benefits of that has on people and on their communities and society at large. So we really need, we've seen with the pandemic, we've seen with the shift to, or the call at least, to shift from a fossil fuel intensive economy to a green transition to renewable energy. We've seen with AI that there are these shocks to the labor system that happen, or shocks to supply chains, for example, and people need to be able to adapt. And many people who are already doing well in this traditional economy have legitimate concerns about the future and about what changes could mean for their ability to provide for themselves and their loved ones. And those concerns are really valid, and they shouldn't be dismissed. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that so many people are left out of the current economy. And so something like a guaranteed basic income just provides that safety net for people. And the research shows that it doesn't actually, as many people fear, make people less likely to work. What it does provide is some breathing room for people to maybe improve their education and training to transition to a better job. It allows people to not have to take the super low wage, precarious, terrible working condition, abusive employer situation because they're so desperate. And so basic income is one critical component, I think, of what what we could develop in terms of a social safety net that works for everyone and helps people with those times of transition. There's also a really interesting campaign and call for among, I think, over 150 organizations who are calling for a youth climate corps, which would be a national paid job training program where anyone under 35 could apply and sign up to do climate adaptation and mitigation work in their communities. So again, we're addressing the need for employment, particularly for youth. We're addressing the impacts of climate change and this transition that is needed in training people and helping them develop the skills for a more renewable energy focused economy. So, so those are just two examples of some of the policies that we could use. And again, the more that we strengthen our social safety net through programs like publicly funded, publicly delivered childcare, pharmacare, Medicare, again, the more that we address these, the impact on the cost of living by these for-profit, private actors, then again, the better we can protect the buying power of people's earned income.
Natalie, we haven't talked about a group of people that may not be able to work either through physical impairment or mental health issues, or they may be able to work but may need specific accommodations in order to do that. How can we help them enter and re-enter the labor force?
Yeah, that's a great part to bring up, because there are a number of people who, for many valid reasons, are unable to participate even part-time or full-time in the labor force, in the paid labor force, I should say. Many of these folks who are outside of the paid labor force are contributing to our communities in many other ways through volunteerism or caregiving. But again, this is an area where we could develop better regulations to ensure that employers are providing accommodations for people with disabilities, because there are many, many ways that people with intellectual or physical or developmental disabilities can and do participate in the paid labor force. It's a really meaningful way for people to engage in their communities and connect with others. And so there are some wonderful contributions that people with disabilities are making. But they're going to face certain barriers depending on the types of work that are available to them, the schedules that they're required to work. So whether there's flexibility in working from home or working on site, flexibility in scheduling. This is particularly difficult for people who have episodic disabilities, for example, who aren't able to predict necessarily when they might be experiencing symptoms that would prevent them from work. So again, more incentives and regulatory controls to ensure that people with disabilities can be integrated meaningfully into the workforce, and then for folks who are not participating in the paid labor force because of caregiving responsibilities. Again, we need to look at what are the measures in our social safety net to ensure that we are making the conditions such that people who are taking on this critical, important work, whether that's childcare or maybe caring for someone with a disability or caring for an elder, that they are also not sacrificing their adequate standard of living to do that work. And again, it's really important to note the gendered and the racialized elements in this. So women in Canada still do 1.5 times more unpaid care work than men, according to research by Gender in the Economy. We still see women and gender diverse people and racialized people with precarious immigration status really overrepresented in care work, but particularly in the lower paid positions in care work and the more precarious positions in care work. We really saw this highlighted in the pandemic when we were looking at migrant care workers, for example, and folks who were working in long-term care homes and had to work at multiple homes because none of their individual contracts provided them with sufficient hours or wages or sick leave. And so again, when we see these faults in our social safety net, it really impacts people's ability to participate in the paid labor force and to access that adequate standard of living.
That's powerful, powerful stuff. There is a rumor out there that spring is approaching, and with the approach of spring, our minds turn to fresh fruits and vegetables. Here in southern Ontario, where I live, we are anticipating the beginnings of farmers markets, and we know that more and more local producers are depending on migrant workers to pick fruit, vegetables, to care for their produce. But we know that that's a sector of the economy, very important, but with migrant workers have very little protection. And I wondered if we could talk about that and the justice around and policy around those issues.
Yeah, so for all the talk about immigration levels these days, folks are really missing the fact that migrant labor is absolutely essential to our economy, and unfortunately in a very exploitative way. So Stephen, you gave the example of people working on farms and throughout our food systems. There's heavy involvement of migrant workers and often seasonal workers or temporary work permits. And but the same is true, as I mentioned, in our healthcare system, in in a lot of our service industries. And so again, our economy depends on this labor, and we depend on these people who either come and stay, but are continually having to renew their status, or people who come seasonally. And while they're here, they're doing these jobs that are critical to our economy. They're part of our communities. They're contributing to their communities. Their children go to school here, and yet for all their work, for all their contributions to the tax system, even, they're shut out from so many of our social safety net supports. So even if their children are born here, if they have precarious immigration status, they can't access the Canada Child Benefit, for example. We see really egregious abuses of people who are here on closed work permits, which means that their status here in Canada is tied to a contract with a particular employer. So that makes people really vulnerable, really scared to raise concerns about abuses of that employer, because they're afraid that if they speak up, they risk deportation. If they get sick, they risk deportation. If tragedy strikes and they're unable to work, they risk deportation. And so this many of these problems really come down to this lack of status, this precarious status. And so one way that we could address that, which might sound a bit radical, but really isn't as radical as it sounds, is to regularize status for all. And sometimes when we talk about that, people go, "Oh my goodness, like, you mean just let anyone who wants to come here?" But the fact of the matter is that most of the people that would have their status regularized are already here. They're already part of our communities. They're already providing these essential services in our economy. And it would just ensure that, again, that these folks who may have been born in other countries, as many of us or our ancestors have been, if you're not someone who has First Nations or Inuit or even Métis ancestry, they're here, they're contributing to our communities and our economy, and they have the right to an adequate standard of living as well. So CPJ has produced a few great reports that I will pop the links to in the chat if you're interested in learning more. So we have a report that was authored by one of our former public justice interns, Ashvini Uttaya-Kumaran, who looked at our abuses against migrant workers. We have a report that looks at migrant access to healthcare that's called Work, Study, Pay Taxes, but Don't Get Sick. That was authored by our former refugee and migrant rights policy analyst Emilio Rodriguez, along with someone from the Canadian Health Coalition. And we also have a report that looks at some of the barriers that are facing migrants who were internationally trained in healthcare professions whose accreditations are not being recognized here in Canada. So I'm going to pop those in the chat for folks who would like to dig more into that.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. I knew I came to the right place. My mind is well, it's full. And I have one more question for you. While our conversation tonight is taking place just under a month away from a federal election, where in all of our communities, people will be knocking on our doors, asking for our support, asking for our votes. Last week, Mario provided us with some rather poignant questions to be asking folks at the door. Do you have some suggestions? I know there's an election bulletin that you have. What recommendations do you have for engaging wannabe representatives that knock on our door?
The first thing that I share with people often when they're thinking about engaging candidates or elected officials is just to reassure you that you don't have to be a policy expert to let your candidate or your elected representative know what you care about, to know what matters to you, and to know what you expect of government to deal with. So if I can just, encourage people that, and I'm sure many of us have found once you do talk to folks in these positions, you realize, yeah, they're just people. And many of them also don't have expertise in these areas as well. And, at the best of times, it's an opportunity to engage people in real sincere discussion about what do we know about these issues based on evidence and based on people's lived experiences, and what does the evidence tell us we could be doing better. And so in our election bulletin, and I think Sarah, thanks for putting that link in the chat for us, there's a section for each of our key policy issues. So the section on poverty, I was really restrained and restricted, I should say, in how much I had to say. So I'm grateful that I kind of get to cheat by just referring people to the Poverty Trends report, because I was told I had 250 words to provide an overview of poverty in Canada. So there's a little bit of an overview that just talks about some of the factors that we're facing right now with this affordability crisis, this shift to privatization and for-profit models, this need to exercise every policy lever available to ensure that people have the conditions where they can access an adequate standard of living. So the questions that are shared in the election bulletin, if you're engaging your candidates around poverty in Canada, some of them ask about what their party's platform includes in terms of these regulatory controls and investments that they would use to strengthen the social safety net for all people living in Canada. There's some really specific intentional language used there in terms of, we're not even just talking about Canadian citizens, but all people living in Canada, asking, are they going to bolster these publicly funded, publicly delivered programs and services and crack down on profiteering? And what are their plans to create these conditions where all people can access an adequate standard of living? I also cheated a little bit because I was told I would get like 3 questions, and you'll notice that each one of them has multiple parts probably. So there are some specific policy recommendations that I've suggested that you ask about, including things like expanding healthcare and pharmacare, or increasing the proportion of affordable non-market housing, expanding the adequacy of income supports, including the new Canada Disability Benefit, and generating the revenue that's needed for these programs, the infrastructure that's needed by undoing years of corporate tax cuts, closing tax loopholes, and implementing a wealth tax on wealth over 10 million. So there's a few really specific questions and specific language that you can use to ask candidates. And again, they're probably not going to do a deep dive into the detailed legislative components of their plan. So what you can listen for is, are they offering you overly simplistic solutions to these complex problems? Are they scapegoating? Are they redirecting to some other issue? Is their focus on affordability, or is their focus on life being a bit more expensive for people who have enough? And so again, where's their attention focused, and what are the policy levers that they're planning to use to live up to these treaty and human rights obligations?
Well, as always, Natalie, thank you so much for your wisdom, your insights, your provocations, and the work that you do, the passionate work that you do at CPJ. And thank you for being with us tonight. It's been an eye opener for me and a real pleasure to speak with you.
Well, thank you again for the invitation, and thanks, Stephen, for guiding our conversation in such a good way, and to everyone for listening.
I'm just going to turn it back to Father Trevor.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Natalie, for that engaging conversation and those insights. And what we did last time, before we go into small groups, would be if anybody has any initial questions that they would like to ask before we go into small groups, clarification question, or even just to explore a little deeper on something you shared, Natalie. We'll have time at the end of the sharing sessions as well before we conclude for the evening. But if there's anything that people would, I wouldn't call it a burning question, but something that they'd like to ask you now. I have a couple, but I'll refrain from. And you just put up your hand in the normal Zoom way. Or the natural way, Peter.
Thank you very much, Natalie and Stephen. It seems to me there have been some legislative attempts at a guaranteed basic income. Is that right?
So there have been some legislative attempts provincially, and federally. What we have seen, there was a motion that was brought forward by Leah Gazan from the NDP and Senator Kim Pate. So there were two identical motions, one brought forward in the House of Commons, one brought forward in the Senate, to develop a framework for a national basic income program. So it was basically calling for research to be done to set out, administratively, legislatively, what could a national guaranteed livable basic income look like. It was short of implementing one. It was really just saying, well, let's just study what this could look like. And recently, the Parliamentary Budget Officer did release another report. It's not the first, where they modeled a basic income for certain conditions. So a lot of I find a lot of the objections to basic income are really about the particulars of how such a program would be designed, than with the idea in principle of making income supports adequate. So that's a really interesting report to check out, because I think there are design issues there that would need to be tweaked. But that being as it is, it still showed that it would contribute to, I think, I'm forgetting the exact numbers now, but like at least 40% reduction in poverty rates. And it also showed that it would result in a lot of downstream savings to health spending and spending on the criminal justice system. So there is a large body of evidence showing all the benefits that come from these basic income programs. So again, there have been legislative attempts. I know in Atlantic Canada, there is some interest. Quebec, often what we see are programs that are framed as sort of a basic income for this community. So the Canada Child Benefit, for example, was even referred to by the previous Liberal government as a basic income for children and families, or our seniors benefits being a basic income for seniors. So Quebec is trying basically a basic income for people with disabilities. So there are some different projects that have been happening, and they can be at like a municipal scale or a provincial scale. So again, as we often say, the devil's in the details in terms of which model would work. But you know, the evidence is clear that providing people with that kind of stability and security has tremendous benefits.
Thank you.
Thank you. I do have a question, but I just want to point out, I have my background on. Maybe if Stan or Victor, on an open space from 2021, the Jesuit Forum, we had a conversation on guaranteed livable income with Evelyn Forget, guaranteed livable income advocate for Manitoba, and Jesse Golem, who was part of the Ontario pilot project program of guaranteed livable income, and Jamie Swift, and joined by Sister Elizabeth Davis from Newfoundland, GLI advocate as well, and Senator Kim Pate. As kind of a panel, and it really kind of explored, especially that Ontario pilot project program. And Jessie Golem, who was part of this conversation, she was part of the pilot project, and she was a photographer, and she interviewed other people in the Hamilton area who were on the part of the pilot project, and taking photos of them. And so I don't know if either Stan or Victor can maybe and then we put it into an open space newsletter. So maybe have access to that. But I do have a question, and I don't know if you can answer this, Natalie, so don't feel that you have to, because it might be coming out of left field, but it's a question around organized labor and the state of organized labor today. You know, we know the NDP, well, according to the polls, they're not doing very well. You know, and this election is kind of focused on a specific issue. But what's your impression of the effectiveness of organized labor unions, but as well as the New Democratic Party, that's traditionally the party of labor? Is it discouraging? Is it promising? Is there something we're missing? Or
I'll refrain from maybe commenting on any particular party, just because CPJ is a nonpartisan charity. But I will say, just in terms of organized labor, you know, we do really value the partnership of a number of labor unions in a lot of our advocacy work and networks. And I know that they are feeling the pinch where you know, fewer people are you know, joining these unionized joining these unions. And it's difficult anytime, you know, these labor unions that have been around for a long time and have you know, developed a certain size and bureaucracy. It's always difficult when you're trying to engage folks from the top down, right? So they're struggling to develop those meaningful relationships sometimes with people in the workforce. But at the same time, I've also been at events hosted by groups like the Canadian Health Coalition, which you know, involves a number of different labor unions, like the Canadian Labor Congress and the Public Service Alliance of Canada, and different healthcare unions, where their workers are like in there showing up for these rallies. They're engaged, they're committed. And I think what is encouraging is to see in advocacy movements as a whole, this greater intention to really center people's lived experiences. And that can be as workers, as well as, you know, folks that are experiencing the kinds of systemic discrimination or poverty or the issues that we're trying to tackle. So it's been really powerful to hear from healthcare workers, for example, to hear about their working conditions and to hear about the impacts of privatization on their work. We heard again during the pandemic, just hearing from people who are just exhausted and really burnt out, and then again seeing workers kind of siphoned out of these public programs into private for-profit agencies. So I don't know if that answers your question, Trevor. I think there's still a lot of strength in unions, and we're so grateful for their leadership, for their advocacy. I think just anytime you have a movement that has been around for as long as many of these unions have, that it can be difficult sometimes to kind of adapt or rework the way that you do things to incorporate voices that have typically been excluded from those conversations and those circles. So, I think it's just worth mentioning, like, obviously unions have a mandate to focus on the rights and well-being of their workers. But importantly, unions also work for those outside their unionized labor force. So, we can thank them for weekends. We can thank them for our healthcare, for minimum wage, all kinds of benefits that we enjoy and often take for granted these days.
Thank you, Natalie. Maybe we'll have one more question before we break into small groups, and then Peter Zinet.
Thank you very much. It's a great report, and I know how you touched on LGBT issues in your the history. You do cite the amendment to the Canadian Human Rights Code. I applaud that, and I think we got ways to go. This is more a suggestion than a question, but I think one of the tough, toxic workplaces is that if you're in the closet and you can't come out. And this could be on any issue, whether it's a health issue or issue of faith, etc. In 2019, I was volunteering for a music festival. I was told to remove my rainbow sticker from my volunteer ID badge below my name because it was considered branding. I maybe in a future survey or some sort, you may want to consider how, not only to my particular instance on one of the protected grounds, but across all the protected grounds, people may be uncomfortable coming out on their faith or of their health status. That is a factor in saying, I don't want to work here. I'd rather be safe in poverty, oddly enough, than work. When you're, demeaned in toxic workplaces. I developed a website called dignityfordiversity.ca for the purpose of protecting persons who identify with any of the protected grounds of the Human Rights Code, be able to work without removal, reassignment, retaliation, or refusal. I guess this is where I see part of a solution of a healthy workplace, not only in helping people of poverty, but people, everybody. So I'm just flagging that for you. I know you touched on it slightly, and I hope in the future you can look at it some more. As closets are not healthy. One should be not judged for their identity displayed, but be judged for their actions. I mean,
Absolutely.
God made us, everybody. We should be able to do my job. If I'm a bad person, kick me out, but not because I'm what I'm wearing or pin or a celebration of my diversity, not a target of hate. Sorry, I'm rambling, but I'll stop here.
No, it's a great point, Peter, and thanks for raising it. And I believe I'm trying to remember if it's today or yesterday, the Trans Day of Visibility, and we are seeing a real rollback of protections of the rights of people based on sexual orientation or gender identity. We're seeing that in terms of gender affirming care and healthcare. We're certainly seeing it much more overtly in the United States, but we are also seeing that in Canada as well. And obviously, again, that affects people's ability to work. And as you say, Peter, it's only quite recently that that sexual orientation and gender diversity were included under the, grounds for non-discrimination. And we have a long way to go in terms of collecting the disaggregated data that's needed to report on the impacts of different policy decisions on folks in these populations. So absolutely, it's a great point, and needs to be factored into both the regulatory controls and just shifts in public attitudes and perceptions when we're looking at the barriers that people face to finding employment, advancing in their careers, feeling safe and supported in their work, and being compensated fairly as well.
And I'll quickly add, even volunteering, because volunteership gives a gateway to get the experience for you to get future employment and or give back to communities that you were doing. So we got to include volunteers here. Sorry.
Great point.
I was muted. Thank you for that. So we'll go into small groups now. We'll have about 45 minutes of small groups. And there are questions, focus questions related to that the facilitators will lead us into. So we'll probably have about 2 or 3 small groups, I think, based on our numbers. And just a reminder, small group, it's a circle sharing. Imagine you're in a circle, and it's not a back and forth, at least for most of it. It's not a back and forth conversation, but it's a circle conversation facilitated. We'll have about 2 or 3 minutes for each of us to reflect upon the stated question, and then we continue among the circle. And so just wait for your cues from the facilitator, and they'll read out the question and maybe even copy and paste the questions into the chat box for you. So I think without further ado, we'll move into that portion of our evening, and we'll be back at 8:15. We'll come back to the large plenary for a couple minutes.
Thank you. So just to introduce myself, I'm Sarah Rudolph. I'm the social justice animator at the Mary Ward Center and one of the partners of this event and the series of events we've been having on discernment and political engagement. So we have a little bit of time now just to share the fruits of our reflections. So you're invited to share in this large group. Maybe there's a takeaway from your conversation. Maybe there's a particular insight you'd like to share, or maybe you have questions. Natalie is still here, and I think she's game for questions if you have anything pressing you'd like to ask her. So we'll open it up for conversation in this group. And if you can just raise your hand if you want, or if you want to use the Zoom hand, please feel free. And are you wanting to share something?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's all right.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh dear, I've forgotten it again. Yeah, all right, you better go on to somebody else.
Okay. When you think of it again, just wave your hand and we'll go back to you saying.
Mhm. Oh yeah, I remember now. It's, this whole thing has been very informative for me. And I think what's coming to me, I meant to say it in a smaller group, but I've had forgotten it then too. Anyway, it's the fact that the responsibility we have as faith-based people, to bring our voice and our view to the public domain, and I think many of us are reticent, including myself, to do that. But I think nevertheless, this kind of a group would help support that happening. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Thank you. Peter Bisson, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, along the same lines, some of the comments from our group kind of really focused a lot on the dignity of work, and that's not something you hear a lot when you hear economic and social analysis. You hear a lot of numbers. So there's a real place, I think, for faith-based people and work to emphasize these symbolic's not the right word, but values, I guess, that go beyond the quantitative. My own understanding, I'd like to hear more about the kind of the contribution and the history of the labor movements, uh, um, especially today. I'm not looking for a discussion now, but it's just from my own, my own curiosity, and desire to understand the current state of affairs, realizing that labor movement has weakened in recent decades. Why is that? And yeah, things like that.
Thanks.
We're not in the communist internationals anymore, so where's the new energy coming from?
Natalie, did you want to have any comment on that?
Maybe just to say that in a lot of advocacy spaces that I'm in, there is a push to explicitly call for unionized jobs. You know, when we're talking about the need to like create more jobs and get people working, it's that asking that question of, well, what kind of jobs? And the focus on decent work is an expression that gets used a lot. And so there is a push to kind of I guess kind of rebuild the labor union movement, I should say. I don't think I'm well equipped to talk too much about sort of the historical influence and or even contemporary influence of unions, as I'm kind of getting my feet wet in that area myself. But it is a distinct call that I know. You know, I mentioned the idea of a youth climate corps, and that's named there specifically in terms of like unionized work. So that call is there is some explicit language in some of these advocacy movements going forward.
Thank you.
And I think add to that, again, we can't have a discussion here on this now, but the role of, or not the role of, but the reality of rising contract works, whether maybe not even employees, but just contract. And therefore, it's a way to let go of people much more easily and no benefits or anything like that. And that rising reality and how long, like, is this the new reality or is, how long? Yeah.
Yeah, just to build on that, like Uber drivers are their own boss, apparently. They're not employees. So a lot of the gig economy is based in that model.
Yeah. Did you say they're their own boss? Yeah, so
they're considered self-employed.
Yeah, and that sounds very attractive, but
even if it doesn't, it prevents it means Uber's not responsible to treat them as employees.
That's right. But they frame it in a way that makes it sound like I think Jean is
oh yeah, Jean, please go ahead.
Muted though.
Again. This for an Uber, the customer is the boss. And when I go to the doctor, I don't know who's the boss. So it's difficult.
There's a difference between a client who's receiving the service and requesting the service, or like if you hired a contractor, right? You're still the client, but that worker might have an employer. So I know there's that expression, the customer is always right, but I don't think the customer is always the boss in that same way. And some of it's just like legal distinctions too, right? In terms of what is required of employers versus what's required of contracting agencies, or people that are kind of playing that like middle person role, like a broker almost.
like in a lot of big government organizations, who's the boss? You know, who's responsible? That's anyway.
Thanks, Jean. I see Belinda, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to ask, do you have a website or somewhere, and are you going to put this up, like so that other people can watch it, or is it only for us, for the participants? Because I think for me at least, part of what would be helpful is if people know that I'm not just, out there trying to be a show off, like it's real issues, and there are people who have written papers on this, like Natalie, and that it's important, and that I'm part of a broader group of people for educating friends and family who don't understand what I'm doing, because I do this kind of thing for other voluntary groups, but I just wanted to ask that. Is the Zoom session going to be shared on a website somewhere? Or is it
Yes,
only for participants?
Yeah, Stan, maybe?
yes, we're recording the plenary session. So now we are actually recording what's happening now. And we did record the first interview with Stephen and Natalie. But the listening circles, that's not a part that we record because it's supposed to be confidential. And if it were not confidential, I think the sharing wouldn't be the same.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Thank you.
And they'll also be a part of like in podcast form as well. So just the audio. Yeah.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Peter Zanette, I see your hands up.
Hello?
Did you have a question? Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Suggestion is more like it. In terms of, you've done all this great work on this report. I think would be good to have I call it a living document. You captured ideas from this session in the circles and ideas and suggestions and insight as well. But have a document on a website or something that has these ideas, based on report and discussion, so that people can look at them and maybe add to them, and etc. And becomes a living document of something, so that we can all share and see, and look down the road and say, hey, I like that, and may lead to, maybe solutions or something like that. Because beyond this report, what's next? And I'm not holding it to you and not saying it's your, you started this. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this is a great work. And I think part of that, what next is people should read the report, but then submit, look at the comment or ideas suggested already. And if you don't see something, add to it. Right. So that's captured for everybody to see. That's my thing. Thank you.
I will put in a plug for folks to join CPJ's newsletter, so that I know it's not the same as quite what you're suggesting, Peter, in terms of like a forum where people can share their impressions. But it is a way to find out about other events and advocacy campaigns that develop from this research, not just from CPJ, but from our partners and from the broader networks that we're part of. So I'll put a link in the chat where folks can sign up for our newsletter, so that, again, you find other opportunities where you can connect with others and keep that conversation going forward, and join in advocacy campaigns or contribute to submissions that we're making to governments, for example. So like, as an example, the National Housing Council right now is accepting submissions looking at the right to housing for women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people in particular. So we invited our members and others in our networks to collaborate on a submission where people can share either their own lived experience or what they're seeing in their congregations or communities. So sometimes there are those opportunities to feed into what gets shared with government, or to participate in meetings with candidates and MPs and senators and things like that.
Thanks, Peter and Natalie. It was great to see that there's spaces for the conversation to continue and to share our voices in different ways. I'm thinking we're probably running out of time. We're almost at the end of our session, so I'll turn it over to, I don't know if it's Trevor, I guess, for a closing.
Yeah, I think it's me. I just want, before we conclude, just looking forward, a few for the forum anyway, is just to share with you a few. Most of you know this, but for a couple of you that I've already seen it, I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm just going to share with you some visuals of our a few upcoming events we have, the forum, and also with our partners. So we have next week on Tuesday, we have a reading for number 2 with The Hidden Life of Trees. It's a graphic novel, a graphic version of the classic book, The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Woolben. And we're going to be joined by Simon Apolloni from University of Toronto School of the Environment to kind of share with us impressions of this different way, this more graphic, imaginative way of understanding our ecological relationships with the natural world around us. And then on the very next day, next week, on Wednesday, Politics and Cynicism, How to Nurture Hope in Political Conversations, with Dean Detloff of Development and Peace in Caritas Canada. So again, it's part of our political action rooted in discernment in the context, particularly of our federal election. And then in the same, through the same series, on Tuesday, April 10th, so in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be joined by John Malloy, former Ontario MPP and cabinet minister, on politics and faith in a polarized world, a more discerning look. So he's going to speak as a faith-based person, Roman Catholic in particular, in John's case, and how Catholics, faith-based people are called to be involved in politics, but in a prayerful, discerning way, and in the pitfalls as well, especially in a very polarized world. Not just from a Catholic point of view, but generally from a faith-based point of view. And then we're going to be joined by Joe Gunn in May. So we're looking ahead now in a month for our reading form 3, Journeys to Justice, Reflections on Canadian Christian Activism. And it's a book that's a few years old, but it's just a way to share with us the different Christian examples of how faith-based people feel called to be involved in social issues of their times. So I'm not hopefully, but I'm sure that'll be a very inspiring sort of evening of Christ-like examples in our world today. So just a few of those things coming up, but we're sending out emails and so on. So, so on that, I think, Stan, am I missing anything before we officially conclude?
Maybe just mention the elections guide that was put together by the Marwood Center, Catholic Charities, and us. So Sarah just put the link in the chat, and I'm probably going to send the link in the email. So you're going to receive an email tomorrow or the day after the latest with the recording, the link to the elections guide, and a small feedback form that you can fill out with your comments. But thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much for Natalie and Stephen for the discussion and all those great insights. And we hope to see you all soon in more events soon. And of course, all the best in your reflections towards the election.
Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you, Natalie, for accepting, and for Stephen as well for helping facilitate.